In 1885, the Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company commissioned a survey of 40,000 acres in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. The survey was to take 6 months. It took 3 years. Not because of the terrain, though the terrain was punishing, but because the surveyors kept disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, one at a time, over months, in ways that generated no witnesses and left almost no evidence. By 1887, 3 men had vanished. The company sent a fourth, not a surveyor, but an investigator. His name was Ellis Marsh. What Marsh found in those hollows didn't solve the case, but his report, submitted to the company in December 1889 and never made public, describes something that defies easy explanation. This is what we've been able to reconstruct. Before we go any further, look at a map of West Virginia, not a modern one, not one with the highway system and the county seats highlighted, but one from 1880, back when the federal government's geological survey was still incomplete and whole townships existed that had never been walked by anyone who kept written records. Find Pocahontas County. It sits in the eastern highlands, pressed up against what would later become the border of the Monongahela National Forest. The Allegheny Mountains here aren't gentle. They don't roll. They heave. Ridgelines run north to south, like the spines of buried animals, separated by hollows so narrow and so deep that a man standing at the bottom at noon in summer might only have 2 or 3 hours of direct sunlight before the walls of the world closed over him again. The Greenbrier River drains eastward through the county, fed by 100 tributaries, most of them unnamed in 1880, most of them unnamed today. This is the highest terrain east of the Mississippi that isn't technically a mountain. Average elevation in the area we're discussing runs between 3,400 and 4,200 feet. The winters are brutal, not Midwestern brutal, not open and flat and howling, but a different kind of brutal, the kind that comes from being enclosed. Ice forms in the hollows and doesn't melt until April. The red spruce forests that blanket the ridgelines hold snow until May. The rhododendron thickets in the valley bottoms. And when I say thickets, I want you to understand that I mean something different from what that word implies in ordinary speech. Those thickets are architectural. They grow 15, sometimes 20 feet high, with trunks as thick as a man's forearm, their branches interlocking in a canopy so dense that you can walk beneath them in a rainstorm and stay nearly dry. They are also, to any person trying to navigate by sight or by sound, absolutely impenetrable to both. In 1880, the nearest railroad was the Chesapeake and Ohio line, which had just pushed through the New River Gorge 40 miles to the south. The company that owned it. And this matters, because money is always the reason people go into places they shouldn't, saw the highland forests of Pocahontas County as a resource that was, in their language, awaiting development. What they meant was timber, specifically red spruce, which grew in the highlands here at a density unmatched anywhere on the eastern seaboard. Red spruce is light, strong, and straight-grained. In 1880, with the construction boom that followed the Civil War still running hot, there was almost no such thing as too much red spruce. To log it, they needed to know exactly what they owned, which meant a survey, which meant men going into those hollows with chains and transits and field notebooks, walking lines across terrain that had been walked before, by the Cherokee, by the Shawnee, by the long hunters of the previous century, by the families who had built their cabins in the gaps between the ridges and who were, by 1885, beginning to understand that the arrival of the railroad 40 miles away meant that everything was about to change. But never formally, never with instruments, never in a way that produced documents that would hold up in a court of law. The Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company, a subsidiary of the railroad, despite what the name suggests, contracted with a survey firm out of Charleston called Hale and Burnett. Hale and Burnett sent their best man. His name was Franklin Cole, and he was 34 years old, and he had spent the previous decade surveying coal seams and timber tracts across western Virginia and eastern Kentucky. He knew the mountains. He was not a man given to alarm. He vanished in June of 1885, and he was only the first. Let me tell you what we know about the morning Franklin Cole walked into Harlan Hollow and didn't come back. The survey crew had been working the area for approximately 3 weeks. They were making good progress. Cole's field notebooks from the first weeks of the survey show meticulous work, bearing readings recorded to the nearest arc minute, distance measurements corrected for temperature and slope, topographic sketches of remarkable accuracy. He was, by any professional standard, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. The crew numbered 5 men in June of 1885. Cole was the lead. Thomas Rader, 28, was the head chainman. He handled the 66-foot Gunter's chain that they used to measure horizontal distances across the ground. There were 2 other chainmen, younger men named Pollard and Jasper, whose last names we don't have on record because they weren't the ones who vanished, and a rodman named Caleb Stokes, who held the surveying rod while Cole took his readings through the transit. They were camped on a bench above a tributary of the Greenbrier's North Fork, a flat shelf of ground that offered both drainage and a view, which mattered to Cole for his triangulation work. On the morning of June 17th, Cole told the crew he was going to work the lower section of the hollow alone, a section he'd already done preliminary work in, to verify some readings he wasn't satisfied with. This was not unusual. Lead surveyors often worked alone when they were checking their own previous work, when they needed to concentrate, when the terrain was complicated enough that managing a full crew was more hindrance than help. He told Stokes he'd be back by midday. He took his transit, his field notebook, and a small pack with food and water. He did not take Rader. He did not take the chain. By 4 in the afternoon, he had not returned. Rader and Stokes went looking. They followed Cole's obvious track, fresh boot prints in the soft ground along the creek bank, for approximately half a mile into the lower hollow. And then they found his equipment, not scattered, not dropped in a way that suggested haste or accident, stacked. The transit rested on its tripod, properly folded for transport. Tripod, legs closed. The field notebook was placed on top of it, cover up. The small pack sat beside it, unopened. The food inside, untouched. The creek murmured 3 feet away, and it was a warm afternoon, and the spruce trees were motionless in the still air, and there was no sign of Franklin Cole in any direction. Rader and Stokes searched until dark. The next morning, all 5 remaining men searched. They found boot prints, Cole's distinctive narrow boot, leading down the creek bank to where the equipment stood, and then, just beyond the equipment, a section of soft mud at a bend in the creek, where boot prints simply ended. Not at the water's edge, not at any obstacle. In the middle of open ground, the track stopped, as if Franklin Cole had risen into the air. This is the detail that will haunt us for the rest of this story, so I want to dwell on it. Rader, in his statement to Hale and Burnett's office in Charleston, was precise about what he saw. The last boot print was the right foot. It was a full print, heel and toe both clearly impressed into the mud. It was oriented south-southwest, which was back toward the camp. Cole, in his final tracked moment, had turned around. He had been heading back, and then there was nothing. The survey crew searched for 3 days before sending Pollard to the nearest settlement, a cluster of maybe a dozen families 6 miles north at a place called Mill Point, for help. The local men searched. The county sheriff, Amos Bright, rode out from the county seat at Marlinton and searched. Nobody found Franklin Cole. But the field notebook, that's what troubled the investigators afterward more than anything else, and it will trouble us too. Cole's field notebook from the day of his disappearance was found with his equipment. He had made entries that morning, right up to what appeared to be his final working hour. The notebook shows the routine business of a surveyor verifying his previous work, bearing checks, distance measurements, a small sketch of the creek bend with annotated measurements. Nothing alarming. And then, on the final page with writing on it, an entry that departs from everything that came before it. The handwriting is still Cole's. Neat, practiced, the handwriting of a man who has filled hundreds of field notebooks. But the content is different. He describes, in terse professional language, a boundary marker he found that predates any known survey. These were not uncommon in Appalachia. Old corner markers from 18th century land grants still turned up in the woods regularly, their carved letters weathered to near illegibility, their associated documents long since lost or disputed. Cole had found them before. He knew what they looked like. This one, he writes, is not like the others. It is a stone, roughly 2 feet high, partially buried, standing at the junction of 2 creek drainages where no known surveying line should run. It is carved, and here Cole's professional detachment slips for the first time, with symbols that he cannot identify. He describes them, a series of nested angles, like a surveyor's bearing mark, but not quite right. The angles subtly off from the standard notation. A vertical line bisected at irregular intervals, and at the base of the stone, partially obscured by moss, what appears to be a representation of a human figure, or possibly an animal, in a posture Cole describes only as not standing upright. He writes, "The symbols are not Cherokee work. I have seen enough of that to know. And they are not any surveying notation I recognize. The stone itself is very old. I intend to find the corresponding corner marker, if there is one, to determine the line this marker was set for. It runs southwest. I will follow it." And then nothing. He followed that line. And wherever that line went, Franklin Cole went with it, and we don't know where that is. And as of the writing of this script, we still don't. Hale and Burnett sent a replacement, not immediately, not recklessly, but after a 2-month interval in which they apparently believed that Cole would turn up. Experienced surveyors did not simply vanish. He had, the company reasoned, probably followed the anomalous marker into unmapped terrain, gotten turned around, and was making his way out by a different route. This happened. It was inconvenient and embarrassing, but not necessarily fatal. By September 1885, with no sign of coal and no word from any settlement in the region, Hale and Burnett accepted what the physical evidence had been telling them since June. Franklin coal was gone. They sent Thomas Rader, who had, in the intervening months, been promoted from chainman to survey party lead, a promotion no one was celebrating, back to Pocahontas County with a new crew to complete the survey. Rader lasted 6 months. The second disappearance is superficially more explicable than the first, and somehow more disturbing for it. March in Pocahontas County is a month of false promise. The temperatures climb enough to suggest spring. The snow line retreats from the valley floors. The creek levels rise with snowmelt, and then, usually in the second or third week, a cold front pushes down from the north and reminds everyone that winter isn't finished. The red spruce forests, which hold green all year, don't signal the season change the way the lower elevation hardwoods do. In the hollows, in March, it can still feel like the world is suspended. Rader's new crew had spent the winter months at reduced operations, working the higher ridgelines where the survey was less complicated and the terrain more open. By March, they had worked back down toward the lower hollow. Not the specific drainage where coal had disappeared, but an adjacent one, roughly 12 miles to the east. Rader, in his own field notebooks, makes no mention of Cole's disappearance. He was a professional. He was completing a job. On the evening of March 4th, 1886, the camp had run low on fresh meat. This was a common situation and a common solution. One man with a rifle, an hour or two before dark, ranging through the surrounding woods for a turkey or a deer. Rader volunteered. He took his rifle, a Winchester Model 1873 lever action, chambered in .44 4-40, a standard and reliable weapon, and walked north from camp into the mixed hardwood and spruce along the creek drainage. He told his crew he'd be back in 2 hours. He wasn't back in 2 hours. He wasn't back at dark. In the morning, the crew searched. They found the rifle first. It was leaning against a tulip poplar tree, approximately 3/4 of a mile from camp, on a gentle slope above the creek. Leaning against it, not dropped beside it, not stuck in the ground. Leaning against the tree in the casual way a man sets down a gun when he needs both hands for something. The lever was in the down position, which meant a round was chambered and the hammer was cocked. Rader had been ready to fire. He had set the gun down deliberately, carefully. The hammer was still cocked, which meant he hadn't made the gun safe before setting it down, which means he expected to pick it up again immediately. And he had walked away. The boots were found 200 yards further downstream. They were sitting beside the creek, heels together, toes pointing outward, placed with the kind of symmetrical precision that suggests deliberate arrangement. Not dropped, not kicked off in haste. Placed. Rader's socks were not with them. The socks were never found. The creek at that point was 8 inches deep over a gravel bed. The water temperature in March in those hollows is approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit. A man does not wade into water that cold in bare feet in the early evening, in early March, without a very specific and urgent reason. There was no blood. There were no drag marks. There were boot prints leading from the rifle to the boots. Rader's same distinctive prints. The worn heel of his right boot. The slight supination of his gait that his replacement crew described knowing how to recognize. And then, at the water's edge, Nothing. No prints on the opposite bank. No disturbance in the gravel of the creek bed. The creek was clear enough to see bottom across its entire width. There was nothing in it but water. The crew searched for 2 days, then sent to Mill Point for help. The searches were extensive. Sheriff Bright rode out again. He was beginning to develop an attitude about this particular piece of real estate, and noted in his report that the terrain in the vicinity of the boot placement was as thoroughly searched as any he'd seen. No body. No further sign of Thomas Rader. What Sheriff Bright also noted in a margin notation that was perhaps not intended as an official observation, the local families who turned out to help search were noticeably less engaged than they had been during the search for coal. They searched, yes, but they searched the ways they were directed, in the areas they were assigned, and they didn't linger. One of the cut-lip men, probably Josiah's oldest son, though the record isn't clear, told Bright that he'd known from the beginning that the survey was a mistake. When Bright pressed him on what he meant, he said only that certain ground in this county didn't tolerate certain kinds of work. Bright wrote this down. He didn't know what to make of it, but he wrote it down, and it ended up in the county files, and 40 years later, it's one of the few pieces of testimony we have from someone who was there. Hale and Burnett sent a third man, George Sinnate, and George Sinnate's disappearance is the one that changes the entire character of this story. George Sinnate was 41 years old, a veteran of 15 years of survey work in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. He had a wife in Charleston, 2 daughters in school, and a reputation as the most methodical man Hale and Burnett employed. He did not have a reputation for imagination. His colleagues described him, in the letters that survive, as a man who prided himself on precision, who viewed any measurement that couldn't be verified as a personal affront, and who had never, in 15 years of field work, submitted a report with an error. He arrived in the Hollow in April 1887 and spent 6 months doing what the previous 2 surveyors had failed to do, making systematic, documented progress. His field notebooks from April through September are models of professional surveying: bearing, distance, elevation change, topographic sketch, field note, page after page of precise, calm documentation of a complex landscape. He was closing in on completion. By his own calculations, in a letter to the company in September 1887, he expected to close the final section of the survey by the end of October. The final section was the lower hollow. He disappeared on October 14th, 1887. But this time, there was evidence, and the evidence was more disturbing than the absence of evidence had been. Sinnate's camp was on the same bench above the North Fork tributary that Cole had used 2 years earlier. It was simply the best available campsite in the area, flat and drained and with good sightlines. On the morning of October 15th, his crew woke to find his tent in disarray. The canvas had been torn on one side, not cut, but torn, as if pulled hard from outside. His equipment was scattered across the campsite. The transit case opened and the instrument inside, apparently undamaged. The chain coiled and dropped in the dirt 30 feet from where it was normally stored. His field notebooks stacked under a tree with mud on their covers. His dog, a large mixed breed he'd brought for company. A working dog trained to stay in camp. was alive but behaving in a way that the crew struggled to describe. Not injured, not frightened in the way a dog is frightened by a predator or a threat. Howling without pause, facing southeast, facing the direction of the lower hollow. The crew searched. They found no sign of Sinnate anywhere near the camp. The dog would not stop howling for 24 hours, and even after it stopped, it refused to face or approach the southeast. The field notebooks. This is where it gets complicated. Sinnate's notebooks from April through the first week of October are what I described: meticulous, professional, sober. But the final notebook, the one covering the last 2 weeks of work before his disappearance, has a different character, and the change happens gradually, in a way that is more unsettling than if it had happened suddenly. The first pages of that final notebook are normal. Bearing reads, distance measurements, the standard language. But somewhere around page 15, which by internal evidence corresponds to early October, something shifts. The handwriting becomes slightly smaller. The measurements are still there, but there are annotations around them, in margins and between lines, that weren't in any previous notebook. The annotations are hard to read. Sinnate's handwriting deteriorates as the notebook progresses. But they seem to be questions or qualifications. Things like, verify. This reading contradicts bearing taken from Station 4A, and impossible. Distance by chain does not correspond to distance by tachyometry. The measurements themselves, looked at closely, are wrong in ways that are hard to describe. Not wrong as in inaccurate. Sinnate didn't make inaccurate measurements. Wrong as in internally inconsistent. The bearings he records from different stations to the same landmark don't agree with each other. The distances measured by chain don't match the distances calculated from angle and baseline. A triangle whose 3 angles he carefully measured adds up, on one page, to 181 degrees and 14 arc minutes. Triangles don't do that. The interior angles of a triangle always sum to exactly 180 degrees. This is not a rounding error. This is not a transcription mistake. A sum of 181 degrees and 14 arc minutes is impossible. And yet, it's there, in Sinnate's handwriting, with no notation of error, no crossing out, no indication that he noticed anything was wrong. Which means either he did notice and considered it unremarkable, or he didn't notice, which would be far more alarming. Because a man who has spent 15 years measuring triangles and not noticing that one adds up to 181 degrees has lost something fundamental. The last 10 pages are different still. The measurements stop, or rather, they become unmoored from measurement. Numbers appear, bearing-like and distance-like, but not attached to any identifiable objects or stations. Between the numbers are notes, increasingly sparse as the pages go on, that have the quality of a man trying to hold on to something with both hands while the ground moves under his feet. The acoustic effects increase after sunset. The sound comes from below, not from any identifiable direction. I have been unable to locate its source. My compass has been unreliable since Tuesday. I've been setting it aside and using the sun for bearing when possible. When the sky is overcast, this is not possible. I asked Burke to walk a line I had already walked and chain its distance. His measurement differs from mine by 14 feet over 40 chains. 14 feet. I verified his chain is calibrated correctly. I verified mine is calibrated correctly. We measured the same distance on the same ground and came back with different answers. I am not sleeping well. This is probably a factor. I am aware that sleep deprivation affects perception and judgment. I am trying to account for this. And then, 5 pages before the end of the notebook, the measurements return. But they're different. Wild. Bearing readings of 400 degrees, which is impossible on a compass that reads from 0 to 360. Distance measurements of -14 chains. Numbers that have become untethered from the physical world they were supposed to describe. And the final entry on the last page with writing, written in a hand that is still recognizably Sinnate's, but has gone shaky. The letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone who is concentrating very hard on each one. The hollow is wrong. The measurements don't work. Something is taking the angles. That was October 14th, 1887. George Sinnate was never found. Before Ellis Marsh arrives, I want to spend a moment with the landscape itself, because the landscape is not background in this story. The landscape is a character. Harlan Hollow. The name appears in the county's informal geographic record going back to at least the 1830s, attributed to a family named Harlan, who may have briefly settled in the area before moving on. Though no Harlan family appears in Pocahontas County tax records before or after that period. Runs roughly southeast to northwest for approximately 4 miles, a narrowing cleft cut by a fast creek through the highland spruce forests of the Allegheny watershed. The geology of the area is complex in ways that weren't understood in 1887 and aren't fully mapped even now. The highland plateau of eastern Pocahontas County sits atop a massive folded ridge of Devonian and Silurian sedimentary rock, sandstone and shale, mostly, but threaded through with intrusions of much older material. Precambrian basement rock that was forced upward during the Allegheny orogeny 400 million years ago. In some of those intrusions, the rock is highly magnetic. Magnetite, iron oxide, the mineral that compasses respond to, occurs in concentrated deposits scattered through the highland in a pattern that the 1880 Geological Survey had identified in general terms but not mapped in detail. Harlan Hollow sits directly above one of those deposits. How concentrated, how deep, how extensive, nobody knew in 1887. Nobody has done a modern magnetic survey of the area either, because the land in question has never been commercially valuable enough to justify the expense. The hollow also has, at its lower end, a geological peculiarity that the Cherokee people had recognized and named, and that the white settlers who came later acknowledged without fully understanding. The creek that runs through the lower hollow disappears underground at a point approximately half a mile from the mouth of the hollow. It goes into the ground through a series of sinks, limestone dissolution features common in this part of Appalachia, and emerges again, or probably emerges again, somewhere in the valley, 2 miles to the south. But the underground section passes through a cave system that hasn't been fully explored, and the air exchange between the surface and the cave system creates, in certain atmospheric conditions, a barely perceptible airflow from the ground that carries whatever gases have accumulated in the underground passages. Coal seams underlie much of Pocahontas County. The county would become, in the 1890s and early 1900s, one of the most intensively mined coal regions in the eastern United States. The Pocahontas coalfield, seam thickness reaching 14 feet in some places, the coal so clean and high carbon that the U.S. Navy would eventually standardize on it for their warships. But in 1887, those seams were untapped, and in the hollows above them, natural gas, methane, along with heavier hydrocarbons, seeped upward through fractures in the rock. Methane, in low concentrations, doesn't smell and doesn't cause obvious symptoms. In somewhat higher concentrations, still well below explosive limits, it displaces oxygen and can cause subtle cognitive impairment. Difficulty concentrating, poor judgment, a feeling of disorientation that comes on so gradually, the affected person often attributes it to fatigue, or cold, or imagination. In higher concentrations still, it can cause what historical sources usually call mountain sickness. The Appalachian miners had a name for it, different names in different parts of the region. But the experience was recognized. Men who worked in areas with gas seeps came out of them confused, sometimes aggressive, sometimes hallucinatory. And the people who knew the land best knew to watch for the signs. The Cherokee name for the lower hollow, the name that Mooney would later give to Ellis Marsh, translates, in Marsh's own rendering, as the place where direction fails. Mooney explained to Marsh that this was not a metaphorical name. It was a descriptive one. People who went into the lower hollow came out pointing the wrong direction. The Cherokee had recognized this and had, sensibly, treated the hollow as a place to be avoided. The white settlers who came later hadn't learned this lesson, or hadn't learned it in a form that translated into avoidance. They had learned it as, that place is bad luck, and you don't go in there, which is not the same thing as understanding why. None of this explains the disappearances. Not fully, not satisfactorily. But it provides the frame through which Ellis Marsh would eventually attempt to see them. The Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company did not get where it was by accepting unexplained losses. They had 3 missing surveyors, 2 years of work, thousands of dollars in salaries and equipment, and a 40,000-acre tract that couldn't be logged until the survey was complete. And they had no explanation. The county sheriff couldn't help. The survey firm couldn't help. The company's own management knew nothing about the terrain. What they needed was someone who could go into the hollow and find out what was happening. And what they needed that person to be, above all, was rational. They hired a Pinkerton. His name was Ellis Marsh. Marsh was 45 years old in January 1888, a former railroad detective who had made the transition to private investigation work after a stint working security for the B&O Railroad in the 1870s. He was based in Baltimore, but had worked throughout the Mid-Atlantic and Upper South. His case record, insofar as it can be reconstructed from company and agency records, includes a coal mine sabotage investigation in western Maryland, a series of cattle thefts in the Virginia highlands, and what appears to have been a complicated matter involving a county tax assessor and a disappearing land deed in 1884. The kind of case that doesn't generate newspaper coverage, but requires exactly the kind of patient, methodical evidence gathering that was Marsh's specialty. He was not, by his own accounts or the accounts of colleagues, an imaginative man. His letters are direct and precise. His case reports are organized in a formal structure that reflects legal training, or at least legal discipline. Observation, hypothesis, evidence for, evidence against, conclusion. He was not unkind, but he was not soft. In a letter to his wife from Baltimore, written the night before he departed for Pocahontas County. He describes the assignment as a peculiar business involving a timber survey and 3 missing men, which I expect will resolve into something prosaic once properly examined. He arrived in Marlinton, the county seat, a small town of perhaps 300 people, in 1888, on a Tuesday in mid-January. He had taken the C&O Railway to Caldwell in Greenbrier County to the south, and then hired a wagon for the remaining distance north into Pocahontas County, on roads that were, in January, barely negotiable. His first stop was the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Amos Bright was 52 years old, had been sheriff for 11 years, and had approximately no interest in the Harlan Hollow situation beyond the paperwork it generated. He was not hostile. He showed Marsh every document in the file, answered every question, made his deputies available for a briefing, but his overall demeanor, Marsh later wrote, was that of a man who had decided the problem was not his problem and was willing to spend a moderate amount of energy confirming this conclusion. 3 men gone in as many years, Marsh noted in his initial log. The sheriff's position is that they likely met with accidents, falls into ravines, drownings, animal attack, and that the remoteness of the terrain simply prevents recovery of the remains. He is not wrong that this is possible. He is, I think, more attached to this explanation than the evidence warrants, because the alternative explanations require action he is disinclined to take. What Bright told Marsh, beyond the official files, was this. The Hollow had a reputation. Not a recent reputation. The missing surveyors had deepened it, obviously, but the reputation predated them. Families in the area had avoided the lower hollow for as long as anyone could remember. He himself had never gone in further than the mouth of the hollow, despite 11 years of sheriffing the county. He said this without embarrassment, as if avoiding a section of terrain known for accidents was simple common sense. He told Marsh about the Cutlips. "If you want to know about that hollow," Bright said, "you want to talk to Josiah Cutlip. His family has been on that land since before there was a county to put them in. He knows more about what's in those woods than anyone alive. Whether he'll tell you anything useful is another matter." Marsh wrote this down. He wrote everything down. Hale and Burnett had, sensibly, removed the remaining survey crew from the field after Sinnate's disappearance. They were now in Marlinton, staying in the same boarding house, waiting to either be reassigned or dismissed. They were 4 men. Burke, the chainman who had measured the same distance as Sinnate and come back with a different answer, a rodman named Posey, and 2 other chainmen whose names were Campbell and Dix. Marsh interviewed them separately over 2 days. He was looking for inconsistencies, for signs that one of them was hiding something, for any detail that didn't line up between their accounts. He found none of these things. What he found was 4 men who were genuinely frightened in a way that seemed too consistent to be performance. Burke was the most informative. He was 26, steady and practical, and he had been with Sinnate's crew from April through October. He described the progression of the hollow clearly. The first months, normal work, no issues. Then, in September, small things that didn't make sense. A blazed tree that showed up in a position it shouldn't have been in based on previous triangulation. A morning when his compass read 15 degrees off from the day before and corrected itself by midday. sounds at night that he'd put down to wildlife, but that Sinnate had apparently taken more seriously. He started keeping the dog close after the second week of October, Burke said. The dog had always ranged pretty free. It was a good camp dog, but Sinnate started tying it up at night. He didn't say why. By the last week, he was sleeping with the rifle. Marsh asked about the anomalous measurements, the distance discrepancy, the impossible triangle sum in Sinnate's notebook. Burke looked at his hands. I measured that line 3 times, he said. Same answer every time. 41 chains, 6 links. Sinnate measured it and got 40 chains, 28 links. That's 14 feet of difference over a distance of maybe 2,700 feet, on flat ground, with the same chain. He looked up. I've been surveying for 4 years. That doesn't happen. Marsh pressed him. Was the ground actually flat? Could a slope correction explain the discrepancy? I know how to apply a slope correction, Burke said, with the mildness of a man containing irritation. The ground was flat. I applied no correction because none was needed. Sinnate applied no correction because none was needed. We measured different distances on the same flat ground with the same calibrated chain. The other 3 men added texture, but no new facts. Posey had heard the sounds Burke mentioned, a low sound, irregular, that seemed to come from below rather than around, that he'd felt in his sternum more than heard with his ears. Campbell and Dix had noticed the compass issues and had asked Sinnate about them. He'd told them the area had magnetic deposits, and they shouldn't worry about it. But this was in September, before his own notes suggest he'd become alarmed. All 4 of them, separately and without apparent coordination, told Marsh the same thing when he asked if they thought the missing men were dead. Yes, they were certain, but they were also certain that whatever had happened to them hadn't been an accident. Men don't vanish, Burke said. Not 3 of them. Not in the same place. Not the same way. Marsh spent 4 days interviewing families in and around the Hollow's approaches. He visited Mill Point, the small settlement 6 miles north, and 2 or 3 farmsteads scattered along the ridges above the hollow. The conversations were sometimes guarded. Strangers from the city were not automatically trusted in Pocahontas County in 1888, and a Pinkerton badge was more likely to inspire wariness than confidence. But Marsh was patient, and he was from Baltimore, which was at least not from New York, and he brought tobacco, and didn't press too hard when people went quiet. The picture that emerged was consistent, if not precisely informative. The lower hollow had been avoided by the local families for as long as anyone could remember. The avoidance was not dramatic or ceremonial. It was simply practical, in the way that practical mountain people are practical about things that have hurt them before. You didn't go into the lower hollow because things went wrong there. Animals, dogs mostly, that went into the lower hollow sometimes came back and sometimes didn't, and the ones that came back were often confused and off their feed for days. A boy from the Miller family had wandered into the lower end of it 15 years back and been found 2 days later, 6 miles to the east, thoroughly lost and unable to explain how he'd gotten there. He was fine, but he'd been fine in the hollow too. He hadn't fallen or been attacked. He'd simply been unable to find his way out until he'd climbed high enough to get above the spruce canopy and orient himself by the ridgeline. The compass thing Marsh asked, carefully, whether anyone had noticed unusual compass behavior in the area. An older woman at Mill Point, a widow named Hartzell, told him without much affect that her late husband, who had been a hunter, had stopped carrying a compass years before his death because it didn't work right in the lower part of the country. This was not delivered as a strange thing to say. It was delivered as a simple matter of fact, the kind of local knowledge that gets passed down and accumulated and doesn't require explanation. What Marsh was building, through these interviews, was a picture of a place that had a long history of being anomalous, and a community that had adapted to that anomaly through the most sensible means available, staying away from it. The surveyors were not the first outsiders to be hurt by their failure to heed local knowledge. They were simply the most recent. What none of the family said, and Marsh noted this absence, was that they thought someone was responsible. He asked obliquely whether there were people living in the hollow. No one admitted to knowing of anyone. He asked whether there had been anyone who might have had reason to interfere with the survey. Everyone became more careful at this point. Not evasive, exactly. Careful. The land dispute thing hung over the room in a way that made Marsh's investigative instincts sharpen considerably. Because there was a land dispute, he'd found it in the county records before leaving Marlinton, and it was not trivial. The Cutlip family had been in Pocahontas County since 1793, when a man named Isaiah Cutlip had received a land grant of 800 acres from the Virginia Commonwealth for his service in the Revolutionary War. The original grant was documented, the boundaries clear enough for 1793. Creek beds and ridge tops and blazed trees, the usual imprecise markers of early American land surveying. And the family had been there ever since. 4 generations, a family cemetery on a flat above the North Fork, fields carved out of the forest on the south-facing slopes where the sun hit long enough to grow corn and beans, a tannery at one point that had given the local creek one of its informal names. The problem was that Isaiah Cutlip's 1793 grant included, almost certainly, land that the Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company believed it had purchased from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and later West Virginia, after the state split in 1863, during one of several large-scale timber rights acquisitions in the 1870s. The history of land ownership in the Virginia highlands was a palimpsest of overlapping claims, conflicting surveys, and paperwork that had been lost or burned or simply never generated in the first place. And the Cutlips were not unusual in having a claim that was both historically legitimate and legally ambiguous. What was slightly unusual was the history of how they defended that claim. The county records in Marlinton contain 2 references to disturbances involving Cutlip family members and outside interests. One was from 1854, involving a land agent for an Ohio-based land speculation company who had come to survey what he believed was company property, and who had left, according to his own written complaint, having been persuaded in no uncertain terms to abandon the work. The complaint was not specific about the nature of the persuasion. The second was from 1871, when a federal tax assessor had attempted to survey the Cutlip homestead for tax purposes and had returned to Marlinton with a story about being followed through the woods for 3 miles by men he never saw but could hear parallel to him in the trees. The assessor had assessed the property from memory based on his brief view of the house and had not returned. Marsh noted all of this. He did not conclude anything from it, yet. What he wanted, first, was to meet Josiah Cutlip. The Cutlip homestead was accessible from the north, a 3-mile walk from the road along a creekside path that was clearly maintained. Trimmed brush, kept drainage, the kind of path that gets walked regularly. The homestead itself was substantial for the Highlands. A 2-story log house with a frame addition, a large barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and the visible evidence of a working farm. Dogs announced Marsh's approach well before he reached the clearing. Josiah Cutlip was 68 years old. He was a large man, not fat, but dense, with hands that had the look of tools, wide, hard, precisely competent. He stood in the barn doorway and watched Marsh come across the yard without moving. And when Marsh introduced himself and showed his credentials, Cutlip's expression did not change. He was not hostile. This is important. He was not the suspicious mountain patriarch that popular fiction would cast him as, and Marsh was careful to note this. He was simply contained. He answered questions with answers that were exactly as long as they needed to be, and no longer. He confirmed that his family had been in the Hollow since 1793. He confirmed that they had concerns about the timber company's survey. He confirmed that they had participated in the searches for the missing surveyors. He did not ask Marsh what the company intended to do about the land dispute. He didn't need to. They both knew the dispute was the water under the whole conversation. What Marsh had not expected was Delia Cutlip. She came out of the house midway through the conversation, 32 or 33, Marsh estimated, with dark hair and the particular directness of gaze that Marsh associated with people who had never had reason to pretend to be less intelligent than they were. She sat on the porch steps and listened, and then, when Josiah's answers had exhausted themselves, she said, "You're here about the surveyors." "I am," Marsh said. "The third one," she said. "George Sinnate. All 3. She was quiet for a moment, then, "We found him." The word found stopped Marsh absolutely cold. He asked her very carefully to tell him what she meant. What she meant was this. On October 16th, 1887, 2 days after Sinnate's disappearance, she had been walking the ridgeline path above the hollow, a route she took regularly, and she had come across George Sinnate standing in the middle of the path. Standing, not collapsed, alive, not dead. He was not injured as far as she could see. He was not lost technically. He was on a path which a lost man might not be, but he was in a condition she described, carefully, as not in his mind. He didn't recognize her, although she'd spoken with him on 2 previous occasions when the survey crew had passed near the homestead. He didn't respond to his name. His eyes were open and tracking, but he didn't seem to be seeing what was in front of him. He was moving slowly in a direction. She demonstrated, northeast, which would have taken him off the path and into the steep upper hollow. And when she'd stepped in front of him, he'd walked around her, the way a blind man walks around a chair. She had tried to guide him back to the road. He'd been uncooperative, not aggressive, just inert, moving in the direction he was moving with the dumb persistence of water running downhill. She'd followed him for perhaps a 1/4 mile, trying, and then he'd turned off the path into the rhododendron thickets, and she'd lost him. "Why?" Marsh asked, in a tone that he worked very hard to keep neutral. Didn't you tell this to the sheriff?" She looked at him. Then she looked at her father. Some communication passed between them that Marsh couldn't read. "Because Sinnate was on our land," she said, "and because if I'd told the sheriff that George Sinnate was walking around alive 2 days after the survey company said he'd gone missing, the first question anyone was going to ask was where he'd been for those 2 days and who had been with him." She paused. "We didn't hurt those men. I want you to understand that. But you know something about what happened to them." She chose her words with visible care. "I know that the lower hollow is not a place men should go. My grandfather told me that. His grandfather told him. The Cherokee name for it," Mooney could tell you the Cherokee name for it, "is something like the place where direction fails. That's not a story. That's a description." "And the 3 missing men? You're telling me they simply got lost and couldn't find their way out?" "I'm telling you," Delia said, "that I found one of them walking, alive, in the wrong direction, 2 days after he disappeared. And I couldn't turn him around, and I couldn't follow him into the thicket. And I have thought about it every day since October." Marsh believed her. He couldn't say why he believed her, which bothered him professionally, but he believed her. He wrote in his journal that night, "The Cutlip woman is either a very accomplished liar or a person genuinely troubled by something she witnessed and cannot explain. I incline toward the latter. Her father, I cannot read. His stillness is either the stillness of a guilty man or of a very old man who has simply seen too much to be much surprised by anything. The Cherokee elder, the locals called Mooney. His full name was James Mooney, a coincidence with the famous ethnographer that seems to have amused him. Lived on the edge of the survey area in a small house that represented, to Marsh's eye, a careful positioning between 2 worlds. He was in his 70s, had been educated at a mission school in his youth, spoke English with precision, and received Marsh with an equanimity that suggested Marsh was neither the most interesting nor the most alarming visitor he'd had in recent months. He knew why Marsh was there. He seemed, if anything, to have been expecting him. The conversation was long. Marsh recorded it in detail in his case notes, the longest single interview record in the file, and it covers both practical and what Marsh called uncomfortably interpretive territory. On the practical side, Mooney confirmed that the Cherokee name for the lower hollow translated in his rendering as something like the place where a man's direction becomes someone else's direction. He was specific that this was a description of an experienced phenomenon, not a spiritual warning. People who went into the lower hollow became disoriented. They could no longer navigate by the instincts and senses they trusted. The direction they thought they were walking was not the direction they were walking. This had been observed over many generations, and the observation had been encoded in the name. He said this directly, and without embellishment. On the question of why, Mooney was more careful. He said that the Cherokee understanding was that certain places in the landscape were what he called confused places, places where the usual relationship between the land and the human sense of direction broke down. This was not supernatural, in his view. It was simply a characteristic of the place, like being rocky or wet or cold. Your people, he told Marsh, try to to explain everything from outside. You want to say, it is this or it is that, the gas from the ground, the stone that pulls the compass needle. These things are real. He paused. But they do not explain everything. The land here has been confused for a very long time. Longer than the gas seeps. Longer than the iron in the stone. He told Marsh something else. He said that the boundary marker Cole had found, the one described in Cole's final notebook, the carved stone at the junction of two drainages, was known to the Cherokee as well. Not Cherokee made, older than that, and not made by any people he knew of. He said, with a precision that Marsh found both reassuring and unsettling, that the marker was approximately at the center of the area of maximum confusion, and that it had been there, unchanged, for as long as the oral tradition went back. Which was, he said carefully, several hundred years at minimum. What are the symbols on it? Marsh asked. I don't know what they mean, Mooney said. I know what they look like. He reached for a piece of paper and drew them. The nested angles, the bisected vertical line, the figure at the base. He drew them from memory, without hesitation, with the confidence of someone who has seen them many times, or who was told of them in enough detail to visualize them exactly. Marsh stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he asked the question he'd been building toward. Did Mooney think the three missing surveyors were alive or dead? Mooney considered this for a while. Then he said, the ones who have gone into that place and not come back, most of them are dead. The hollow does not keep people. They become confused. They go in the wrong direction. They fall. They are not found because the thickets are very deep. But a few, he stopped. A few go in the wrong direction for a very long time before they stop. He said this last sentence with a weight that Marsh couldn't fully account for. He wrote it down exactly and didn't analyze it. Some observations need to sit. In February 1888, with the county still locked in winter, but the worst of the snow off the lower slopes, Marsh went into Harlan Hollow himself. He went prepared. He took a compass, 2 compasses, in fact, which he checked against each other regularly. He took a geological survey map of the county, which was incomplete, but better than nothing. He took 100-foot steel tape and a hand level for measuring his own distances and angles as a check against his compass. He told Sheriff Bright where he was going and when he expected to be back. He went alone because he wanted to observe without managing another person's reactions, and because the alternative was taking one of the survey crew, and the survey crew had made it clear they would not go back. His notes from those days in the hollow are the core of his eventual report, and they are remarkable documents. Day 1. He follows the creek into the lower hollow from the north, which is the approach Cole's crew had used. The terrain is as described. Steep walls, dense rhododendron in the valley bottom, red spruce on the upper slopes, the creek running clear and cold over limestone. He notes the creek sinks. At a point about half a mile into the lower hollow, the creek narrows to a thread and then disappears into a series of openings in the limestone shelf. He can hear it underground, a muted rush, for some distance before it becomes inaudible. The air near the sinks has a faint, sweet smell that he doesn't immediately recognize. Day 2. He begins his instrument work. He sets up his transit at a known point, a blazed tree from Sinnate's last survey that Burke has identified for him from the field notes, and takes bearings to 3 landmarks visible on the ridge above: a rock outcrop, a lone dead snag, a gap in the tree line. He records these. Then he moves to a second known point, 200 feet down the hollow, and takes bearings to the same 3 landmarks. He calculates the triangle. The results, he writes, are not correct. The triangle closes with an error of approximately 0.8 degrees at the apex, an error which I would ordinarily attribute to instrument error or operator error, except that I have verified the instrument's calibration. I have been trained in precise transit work, and 0.8 degrees is an order of magnitude larger than any closure error I have produced in previous work. I repeat the measurements. I get a similar result. I try again, from slightly different positions. The error varies, but it does not disappear. He notes that his 2 compasses agree with each other, but do not agree with the bearing to the rock outcrop that he can verify by sun azimuth calculation. The compass readings are running approximately 6 degrees west of true. This is not consistent with standard magnetic declination for the area, which should be about 4 degrees west. 2 degrees of extra deviation. Small, but real, and explainable by local magnetic deposits. Day 3. He finds the boundary marker. He has been looking for it. Cole's description in the final notebook was precise enough that Marsh could estimate the location, and he finds it exactly where Cole said it would be, at the junction of 2 small drainages, the main creek and a tributary coming in from the east. It is a stone roughly 2 feet high, grayish-green with lichen, partially buried, leaning slightly to the north. It is unambiguously old. The edges of the carved symbols are rounded and blunted by what appears to be decades or centuries of weathering. Marsh spends an hour with the stone. He sketches it carefully. He compares his sketch to Mooney's drawing. They match, detail for detail. He tries to identify the symbols. He has brought with him, in his bag, references, a copy of a surveying manual that includes historical notation systems, a pamphlet on Cherokee symbols, a general reference on North American indigenous rock carvings. Nothing matches. The nested angles are close to surveying notation, but wrong in a specific, consistent way. The angles are slightly larger than standard, as if the symbol was made by someone who knew what a surveyor's mark looked like, but was working from memory, or from a description, rather than from direct knowledge. The figure at the base of the stone. Marsh's rendering in his notes is more detailed than Mooney's, and it adds a detail that Marsh finds difficult to describe without sounding, as he puts it, uncharacteristically metaphysical. The figure is not quite human and not quite animal. Its posture is forward-leaning, its limbs are proportioned oddly, and it appears to be in motion, or the suggestion of motion is carved into it somehow, in the diagonal lean of the whole figure, in the way the limbs trail behind as if caught in movement. I cannot determine, Marsh writes, whether this figure is meant to represent something going into the ground or something coming out of it. He adds, after a pause, in the handwriting that suggests he set the pen down and thought for a while. I have been in this hollow for 3 days. I am not frightened. I am, I believe, too rational to be frightened by carved stones and unreliable compasses. But I am aware, with a precision that I find somewhat uncomfortable, of exactly where the path out of this hollow is. I have been aware of it since I arrived. In a way I am not usually aware of directions in terrain I know. I am not sure if this awareness is a response to reading about others becoming lost here, or if it is something else. Day 4. He finds the blind. He has pushed further into the lower hollow than any of the survey crew. Records indicate anyone has been, following the creek upstream toward its source on the plateau above. The terrain gets steeper, the rhododendron thickets more dense, and the spruce canopy closes overhead until the light is greenish and muted even at noon. He is approximately 1.5 miles from the mouth of the lower hollow when he finds it. It is not a cabin. It is not a shelter in any conventional sense. It is a structure built into the side of the hollow wall, using the natural rock face as one side and constructed of wood and woven spruce branches for the others. It is low. A man would have to crouch to enter. And it is old. The wood darkened and the branches long since dead and gray. But it has been maintained. The most recent material in the structure, a section of woven hemlock boughs on the roof, is fresh enough to still be faintly green. Someone lives here, or has been living here. Someone who has been here long enough to use fresh material and old material together, who has been doing so for long enough that the old material is very old indeed. Around the structure, in the organic debris of the forest floor, Marsh finds bones. Animal bones, as he notes with care. Deer, bear, turkey, smaller animals, all butchered. The cut marks are clean and deliberate, made with a sharp blade, and some of the bones show evidence of marrow extraction. The long bones split lengthwise in the precise way that takes knowledge and practice. This is not opportunistic scavenging. This is skilled hunting and butchery over a long period of time. And in one corner of the structure, used as a support for the roof where a branch has rotted away, a surveying stake. Wooden, sharpened at one end with the number 14 scratched into the flat face. Marsh checks the survey records he's brought. Stake 14 was part of Franklin Cole's original survey line. Cole's stake. In a structure in the lower hollow. A structure that is occupied. Marsh writes, "Someone took Cole's stake. Someone, perhaps, took more than his stake." The question of who lives in this hollow, and for how long, and what they know about 3 missing men, is now the central question of this investigation. He searches the area thoroughly. He does not find a person. He does find one more thing. Beneath a flat stone near the structure, wrapped in oilcloth that is itself wrapped in bark, a cache deliberately hidden, he finds a small collection of objects. A pewter button, very old, a fragment of paper with writing on it in a hand he cannot identify, a compass. The glass cracked, the needle stuck fast at a bearing of 247 degrees. He does not know whose compass it is. He photographs it with the small camera he's brought and leaves it where he found it. He does not want to disturb the cache more than he already has. The compass needle, stuck at 247 degrees southwest. He doesn't know what that means, but he writes it down. On his 5th day in the hollow, Marsh begins to notice things he doesn't like noticing. He has been in difficult terrain before. He is an experienced outdoorsman, methodical and physically capable, not prone to episodes of fear or disorientation. So he notes with clinical attention the following. He has a persistent headache, which he attributes to the cold and the physical exertion of scrambling through dense thicket. The headache is located behind his eyes and has a slightly pulsing quality that is different from his usual tension headaches. his appetite is poor. This also he attributes to exertion and cold. In the afternoon of the 5th day, while making a measurement above the creek sink, he experiences approximately 10 seconds during which he cannot remember which direction the hollow's mouth lies. He has been in the hollow for 5 days. He came in from the north. He has been oriented north-south the entire time. For 10 seconds, standing in a small clearing above the sink where the creek disappears underground, he does not know which way is north. He gets it back. He checks his compass, which reads 6 degrees, off of where he'd expect north to be, as it has for days, and uses the sun, low in the February sky, to verify. He is oriented correctly, but the moment of not knowing is one of the most alarming things he has experienced in his professional life, and he knows that what he experienced is a tiny version of what the missing surveyors described over weeks and months. The gas, he writes that night, camped above the hollow on the ridge. I believe the gas from the underground passages is a factor. The sweet smell near the sink, the way the headache locates itself, the dizziness I experienced this afternoon. I am exposing myself to low concentrations of some gas, methane, probably, or something heavier, that is seeping from the cave system below the limestone sink, and in low concentrations, it is affecting my cognition in ways too subtle to monitor reliably from inside the experience. He decides to spend one more day in the hollow, closer to the entrance and above the sink. On that final day, he makes his most important discovery, and it is not a dramatic one. It is, in fact, the kind of discovery that makes a rational man rethink his rationalism without abandoning it. He surveys the same triangle he had surveyed on day 2. He gets the same result, a closure error of nearly a degree. He surveys a second triangle, anchored on different points. Same error. He surveys a third. Same error. He tries to understand what would have to be true of the physical world for these errors to consistently present themselves in the same direction and the same magnitude. The only explanation he can generate, working with the mathematics of surveying, with the physics of refraction and magnetism, with his knowledge of how instruments fail, is that the ground is not level in the way the instruments assume it is. Not in the sense of simple slope, which his corrections account for. In some other sense, as if the geometric relationship between points on the ground and the horizontal plane the instruments measure from is not what it should be. He writes this down and then sits with it for a long time. There is a word for this in surveying, he writes finally. It is called gravitational anomaly. The instruments assume that gravity acts perpendicular to a level surface. In areas above unusual concentrations of dense rock, iron ore, for example, this assumption can be wrong. The local gravitational field can be deflected toward the concentration of dense material, tilting the effective horizontal plane, causing instruments that rely on gravity to be systematically wrong in ways that are very difficult to correct for. I believe, he writes, that the anomalies Sinnate reported, the impossible triangle sums, the distances that don't match, are real. They are not the products of an impaired mind. They are the products of a gravitational anomaly caused by the magnetite deposits below this hollow. And I believe that a man using instruments in this hollow who does not know about this anomaly would find himself increasingly unable to trust his measurements, his compass, his sense of where he is, until the instruments he has staked his professional identity on become worse than useless. They become actively misleading. They tell him a false picture of the world. He pauses and adds, "I believe this would, for a man who has built his life on precision and measurement, be an experience of profound terror." Ellis Marsh spent 18 months on the Harlan Hollow investigation. He returned to the Hollow twice more, brief trips, cautious, staying above the creek sinks. He gathered geological records from the State Survey Office, which were partial but confirming. He corresponded with a professor of applied physics at the University of Virginia about gravitational anomalies and their effect on survey instruments, and received a response that was both validating and alarming in its implications. He interviewed the cut lips 3 more times, each interview adding texture without adding resolution. He corresponded with the sheriff, with Hale and Burnett's office, with the Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company's legal department. In December 1889, he submitted his report. It was not what the company had hoped for. It did not solve the case. It presented, instead, 3 theories, each supported by substantial evidence, none conclusive, each one casting shadow on the others in ways that made a definitive conclusion impossible. What follows is those 3 theories, as Marsh developed them, as honestly as we can represent them. This is the theory that comes most naturally to an investigator trained in crime, and Marsh took it seriously throughout the investigation. It was also, he acknowledged, the theory he most wanted to rule out, because it implied that 3 men were dead not through accident or misfortune, but through deliberate human violence, and that the responsible party had never been identified or brought to account. The evidence supporting Theory A, the hide blind in the lower hollow. Someone built it, maintains it, and uses it. The cache beneath the flat stone implies a person with long-term habitation in the area, someone who has been there long enough to accumulate objects, who has reason to conceal those objects rather than keep them accessible. Cole's survey stake as a structural support in that blind. This is not ambiguous. The stake did not walk there. Someone carried it from wherever Cole left it, or dropped it, and incorporated it into a structure. That someone had access to Cole's equipment after Cole disappeared. The absence of bodies. In Theory B, the environmental hazard theory, the absence of bodies is explained by the terrain. But in Theory A, the absence of bodies requires no terrain explanation at all. Bodies can be moved, concealed, buried. A person or persons with detailed knowledge of the hollow could dispose of remains in ways that might never be found. Ravines 300 feet deep, concealed by rhododendron. The cave system beneath the hollow's floor, accessible through the sinks. Marsh made careful note of the cave system as a possible concealment site. If the body of a missing man were placed inside the underground passages, which are accessible with effort through the larger of the sink openings, it would require an extraordinary and specifically directed excavation effort to recover them. The passages may run for miles. Without a map, which does not exist, such a recovery is essentially impossible. The cut-lip history. Not conclusive, Marsh never concluded that the cut-lips were responsible, but relevant as background. The 1854 and 1871 incidents in which outside surveyors and assessors were persuaded to leave. The land dispute that gave the family a concrete financial motive to prevent the survey from being completed. The deliberate withholding of Delia Cutlip's account of finding Sinnate alive on October 16th, which Marsh characterized as not necessarily guilty behavior, but certainly not innocent behavior. The Cherokee elder Mooney's knowledge of the hollow, precise, detailed, multi-generational, raised for Marsh the question of who else might have such knowledge. If Mooney knew the hollow well enough to draw the boundary marker from memory, who else did? And if there was someone living in the hollow, which the blind strongly suggested, then that person knew it best of all, and knew it in ways that would make it possible to navigate it safely when others could not. Against theory: A. The absence of any direct evidence of violence. No blood at any of the 3 disappearance sites. No indication of struggle at Cole's equipment cache or Rader's boot placement. Sinnate's camp was disturbed, but it was disturbed in a way consistent with a person leaving quickly in a distressed state, not with a confrontation. If someone was killing these men, they were doing so with extraordinary cleanliness and precision. Delia Cutlip's account. If the Cutlips were responsible for the disappearances, why did she tell Marsh about finding Sinnate alive? It served no purpose she could have anticipated. It implicated her family in the vicinity of a missing man. Marsh spent considerable time trying to understand what the strategic benefit of her disclosure was, and he couldn't find one. She had told him something that put her family in a difficult position, and the most parsimonious explanation for why someone does something self-damaging is that they're telling the truth. The geological anomalies, the gas, the compass deviation. If the hollow reliably disorients anyone who enters it, then the simplest explanation for 3 men who entered the hollow and never came out is not predation. It's the hollow itself. Marsh's conclusion on theory. A. Cannot be excluded. The evidence of habitation in the lower hollow and the presence of Cole's stake in that habitation requires explanation that Theory B and Theory C do not fully provide. If there is a person living in that hollow, and I believe there is, or was, then that person's identity and history and relationship to the 3 disappearances is a material question that this investigation was unable to answer. This is the theory Marsh found most intellectually satisfying, and also the one he found most troubling in its implications, because it suggested that the land itself was the killer, that 3 men had died through an accumulation of natural phenomena that had been invisible to them and had rendered their professional training actively dangerous. The evidence supporting Theory B, the gravitational anomaly, Marsh's own experience, his correspondence with the University of Virginia professor, and the geological record all support the existence of a significant magnetite deposit below the lower hollow that deflects the effective gravitational vertical by a small but real amount. This means that survey instruments, which rely on gravity to establish horizontal, systematically misread. It means that compass bearings are unreliable. It means that a skilled, experienced surveyor, using properly calibrated instruments, in this specific place, will produce measurements that are internally inconsistent and directionally wrong, in ways that cannot be identified or corrected without knowledge of the anomaly's existence. The gas seeps. The sweet smell Marsh identified near the sink, his own headache and momentary disorientation on day 5. The the correlation between the sink location and the area of maximum anomalous behavior in the survey records. These all point toward gas seeping from the underground passages into the hollow air. In the confined lower hollow, in the dense forest, with minimal air circulation, gas concentrations could accumulate, especially in winter, when cold air settles into the hollow and stays, to levels that impair judgment and spatial cognition without causing obvious symptoms of poisoning. The terrain itself as a lethal hazard. Marsh documented the hollow's ravines, unnamed, unmapped, in some cases 200 to 400 feet deep, their lips disguised by a rhododendron overhang so that a disoriented man in poor light might not see the edge until he was past it. He documented the creek sinks. A man who fell into the larger sinks in winter, when the water was high and running fast underground, would be carried into the cave system and could not be recovered. He documented the rhododendron thickets. The mature stands in the valley bottom were, in his description, a kind of underground architecture, their canopy closing overhead and their trunks reducing visibility to a few yards in any direction, their dense branches making compass-oriented navigation nearly impossible. A man who became disoriented in these thickets, Marsh wrote, might walk for hours and cover very little net distance, or might emerge miles from where he entered, or might never emerge at all. Delia Cutlip's account of Sinnate. Theory B actually predicts this. A man who has been exposed to the hollow's disorienting effects for weeks doesn't simply cease to function. He continues to move in the wrong direction, with the mechanical persistence of someone who has lost the ability to correct his own navigation. The direction he walked, northeast, deeper into the hollow, is exactly the direction a man with a deflected sense of north would walk if he was trying to walk south toward the camp. Against Theory B. It doesn't explain Cole. Franklin Cole was in the hollow for a few hours on a single day, not the weeks that it took Sinnate to become visibly impaired. The effects Marsh observed required multiple days of exposure before causing his brief disorientation. A single morning, even in a concentrated area of gas and magnetic anomaly, seems unlikely to impair a healthy adult severely enough to cause a disappearance. It doesn't explain the placement of boots and rifle. These are deliberate acts. A man who has become disoriented by gas and compass anomaly does not remove his boots and place them neatly beside a stream. He stumbles. He sits down. He falls. The deliberate arrangement of Thomas Rader's boots suggests a mind that is still functioning at a level capable of intentional action, which makes the subsequent disappearance harder, not easier, to explain as passive environmental victimization, the absence of similar incidents. If the hollow was reliably lethal to anyone who entered it, why hadn't there been more incidents before the survey crew? The local families avoided it, yes, but they described occasional crossings of its edges. The Miller boy, the hunters who lost their compasses. Why had none of those brief exposures ended in disappearance? Marsh's conclusion on Theory B. The most comprehensively supported theory, but incomplete. The geological and atmospheric hazards I have documented are real, significant, and were certainly unknown to the survey crews. They are sufficient to explain disorientation, impaired judgment, and very possibly fatal accidents in the deep hollow. They are not, by themselves, sufficient to explain all three disappearances in their specific details. This is the theory that occupied the smallest fraction of Marsh's final report, but that he could not dismiss, and that bothered him most in the years after the investigation closed. Not because he believed it, he didn't quite, but because the evidence neither supported nor excluded it in a way that allowed him to set it down. The evidence supporting Theory C, the land dispute. The Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company's survey, if completed, would settle a boundary question that had been contested since at least the 1870s, and the settlement would almost certainly go against the Cutlips. The Cutlip grant was legitimate and old, but land law in post-Civil War West Virginia was not reliably kind to legitimate old grants when corporations with money and lawyers were on the other side of the dispute. The completion of the survey was an existential threat to the family's land. The historical precedent. 1854, 1871. Outside survey interests had been driven away from Cutlip land before, not violently, not in any way that generated criminal charges, but effectively. Whatever had been done on those occasions, it had worked. An outside agent had arrived, attempted to survey, and departed without completing the work. This had happened twice. If a family had found a reliable method of deterring surveyors, and if surveyors kept being sent, why wouldn't they use that method again? The hide blind. Who lives in the lower hollow? Marsh could not answer this question. The Cutlips denied knowledge of any person living there, and Marsh had no way to force a different answer. But the blind was real. The cache was real. And Cole's stake was in the structure. Someone who knew the hollow intimately, who could navigate it despite its anomalies, who had presumably learned over years how to move through it safely, had been there. The Cutlips had been in the area since 1793. If anyone had learned the hollow's characteristics deeply enough to use them rather than be victimized by them, it was them. Delia's withholding of information. Again, not conclusive, but not clean. Against Theory C, Delia Cutlip, Marsh returned to her repeatedly in his analysis. She had found Sinnate alive and had told Marsh about it, unprompted, at the cost of implicating her family in his vicinity. The genuineness of her distress, and Marsh, who interviewed liars for a living, believed it was genuine, cut against the possibility that she or her family had deliberately harmed the surveyors. A woman who has helped kill a man does not sit across from a Pinkerton investigator and describe finding him alive 2 days after he disappeared. The searches. The Cutlip family had participated, actively and visibly, in the searches for all 3 missing men. Guilty parties don't typically search for victims they've concealed, not in communities small enough that their participation would be noticed and their absence even more noticed. The character of Josiah Cutlip. Marsh spent hours with the old man over the course of the investigation, and his final assessment was, he is a man capable of violence in defense of what he considers his. He would not hesitate to shoot a man who threatened his family or his land in an immediate and direct way. But what I see in him is not the stillness of a man hiding a specific crime. It is the stillness of a man who has seen the hollow do what it does over many years, and who is frightened of it in a way that has never, in his lifetime, required him to do anything except stay away from it. Marsh's conclusion on Theory C. I cannot exclude the possibility that persons with knowledge of the hollow's properties used those properties deliberately to disorient and drive away the survey crews, and that this deliberate action contributed to the men's failure to return. What I cannot believe, on the evidence available to me, is that the Cutlips committed murder. I believe, if anything, that the Hollow committed murder, and that the Cutlips watched it happen and said nothing, because to speak was to acknowledge a knowledge of the Hollow that they did not want to share with the law. On the last page of the theoretical section of his report, before the recommendations, Marsh writes something that he clearly struggles with and that he frames very carefully, as if aware that what he's saying doesn't fit the professional tone of everything that precedes it. He describes his last visit to the Hollow in August 1889, when the summer had opened the forest and the rhododendron was in its brief window of flowering. He went to verify a measurement. He was above the sink, at the boundary marker, and the light was long and amber, and the Hollow was as beautiful as such places are in August, when the light gets into them. He describes checking his compass against the sun. The compass reads 5 degrees off west, less than before. He notes this. He sketches the marker again. He prepares to leave, and then he writes, "I became aware that something was watching me. I cannot account for this sensation by any means available to a rational investigator, but I am recording it because I have committed to recording what I observed in this Hollow, without selective omission. The sensation was not a sound, was not a movement in the peripheral vision, was not any identifiable sensory input. It was simply a conviction, as clear and immediate as any physical sensation I have experienced, that I was observed. I checked the surrounding woods. I found nothing. I left the Hollow quickly. I have investigated 37 cases in my career. I have been in dangerous situations. I know the difference between fear produced by genuine threat and fear produced by imagination stimulated by too much time thinking about a strange place. I am recording this incident because I am not confident I know which of those it was." Marsh's report to the Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company was submitted in December 1889. It was 47 pages. The recommendation section was half a page, and it read, in summary, "Abandon the Harlan Hollow survey. The geological conditions make accurate surveying impractical with existing technology. The environmental hazards are significant and unmitigable, and the 3 disappearances suggest conditions that the company cannot, in conscience, ask another survey crew to face. The land, while timberable, is not accessible without a survey, and the cost and risk of completing a survey are not justified by the timber value." The company accepted the recommendation. The Harland Hollow survey was formally terminated in March 1890. The Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company logged other parts of Pocahontas County extensively through the 1890s and early 1900s. The red spruce forests they could access were stripped systematically, but Harlan Hollow remained untouched. The company went bankrupt in 1903, a victim of the financial panic of that year and the rapid depletion of the accessible timber they'd already logged. Their records, survey notes, field reports, legal documents, and Marsh's full report passed through a sequence of legal proceedings and storage situations and ended up in 1941 in the possession of a private collector in Richmond named Hargrove, who was assembling an archive of West Virginia lumber industry history. Hargrove died in 1963 without having cataloged the collection, and it passed to his daughter, who deposited the whole unprocessed archive with the West Virginia State Archives in 1971, where it sat in boxes for another 2 decades before a partial finding aid was created. Marsh's full report, to the best of our knowledge, has not been published. What you've heard today is reconstructed from Marsh's personal correspondence, 17 letters held in the Baltimore collection at the Maryland Historical Society, and the county sheriff's files from Pocahontas County, which cover the period 1884 through 1892 and include both formal records and Amos Bright's personal notations. Both collections are held and accessible to researchers. The Cutlip family retained their land. Without a completed survey, the timber company's claim could not be adjudicated, and after the company's bankruptcy, there was no party to press the claim. The 1793 Cutlip grant remained, legally and practically, their land. Josiah Cutlip died in 1897 at the age of 77. Delia Cutlip married a man named Boggs from Greenbrier County and moved south. She is in the census records through 1920, after which she disappears from the record in the ordinary way of people who live quiet lives and don't generate paperwork. The hollow remained unsurveyed until 1924, when the state of West Virginia, in preparation for the creation of the Monongahela National Forest, sent a survey crew into the area as part of a comprehensive mapping effort. This crew completed their work in 3 weeks without incident. Their survey notes describe no unusual compass behavior, no measurement anomalies, no disorienting effects of any kind. The hollow is noted as remote and heavily wooded, with some rough terrain in the lower section. No mention of the boundary marker, the hide blind, the creek sinks, or anything else that appears in Marsh's report. Whatever was there, if anything, by 1924, was gone. The hide blind, when the CCC crews swept the area in the mid-1930s building trails, was found collapsed and apparently long uninhabited. The cache beneath the flat stone was found. The trail crew's records mention old items under a rock, and its contents were not preserved. The compass, with the stuck needle, was apparently discarded or lost, along with the button and the scrap of paper. In the summer of 1935, a CCC crew, building a trail section through the lower hollow, found human remains in a deep ravine on the eastern wall, concealed by a mature rhododendron thicket whose canopy had grown over the ravine lip. The remains were partial and fragmentary. The medical examiner from Marlinton called to the site estimated they were from a person who had died approximately 40 to 50 years earlier, which put the date of death between roughly 1885 and 1895, the exact period of the disappearances. The remains were never identified. Age, sex, and cause of death could not be determined from the fragments available. They were buried in the county cemetery at Marlinton in an unmarked grave. No subsequent identification has been made, and no DNA analysis has been attempted. In 1952, a spelunker from Lewisburg named Chambers was exploring a cave system in the area. The same cave system that Marsh had identified as likely connecting to the hollow's underground creek, and at a point approximately 800 feet inside the main passage in a section that required a technical rope descent of 30 feet, found a surveying transit. The transit was sitting on a natural rock shelf, as if placed there deliberately, though Chambers noted this seemed impossible given the rope descent required to reach the shelf. The transit was brass and wood, consistent with 1880s manufacture. The case number stamped on the base was from a series manufactured by Buff and Buff of Boston between 1882 and 1888. Hale and Burnett had equipped their survey crews with Buff and Buff instruments. The specific instrument, if it had a serial number, and if that serial number had been recorded against a crew assignment would have identified whose transit it was, and therefore, by inference, how far into the cave system a person, alive or not, had traveled. The serial number was not legible. The transit was donated to the West Virginia Geological Survey in Morgantown, where it is cataloged as Transit, Brass, 1880s, Provenance unknown. How it got into the cave remains unexplained. Marsh continued working as an investigator until 1898, when a knee injury sustained in a fall during a completely unrelated case in Baltimore forced his retirement. He died in 1911 in Baltimore at the age of 68 of pneumonia. His personal papers, including correspondence and what appear to be personal journals from his later life, were donated to the Maryland Historical Society by his daughter in 1935. Among those papers is a journal entry, undated but from contextual references, probably written sometime around 1905, when Marsh was in his early 60s and had been retired for several years. It is addressed to no one in particular, written in the reflective manner of a man working through something he's been carrying for a long time. It reads, "I have investigated 37 cases in my career. Harlan Hollow is the only one I cannot explain by any single theory. The land itself seemed to resist understanding. I do not believe in the supernatural, but I believe that there are places in this country that have not yet been fully described by science, and that our confidence in our maps is premature. The 3 men who went into that hollow and did not come back deserve an explanation. I did not find one sufficient to satisfy either the law or my own judgment. I have thought about them often, especially Sinnate, a man I never met, a man I know only through his disintegrating handwriting in a notebook I held in my hands on a winter afternoon in 1888. He measured the same world I measured and found it different. I still do not know if the difference was in the hollow or in him. I suspect it was in both." He writes, further down the same page, "The stone with the symbols. I have looked for them in every reference I could find, and I have never matched them. I do not know who put that stone in the hollow, or when, or why. I know that it was old. I know that it was precise. Whoever made it was not unskilled. I know that Franklin Cole found it and followed the line it suggested, and I know that whatever was at the end of that line, Cole did not come back from it. And then, in the final lines, in handwriting that is the same measured hand as all the rest, I went back once after the report was filed, not for the company, for myself. I went to the lower hollow and I stood at the boundary marker, and I looked at the figure at the base, the one that might be entering the ground or might be emerging from it. I stood there for a long time. I did not feel observed that last time. I felt alone in a way that was different from ordinary solitude, as if the hollow had finished with something and had no further interest in whoever might come through. I do not know how to explain that feeling either. I have written it down because it happened. The Chesapeake and Ohio Timber Company went bankrupt in 1903. Their records, including Marsh's full report, were acquired by a private collector in 1941. The report has never been published. What you've heard today is reconstructed from Marsh's personal correspondence and the county sheriff's files, both of which are held in the West Virginia State Archives. Pocahontas County today is one of the least populated counties in the eastern United States. The Monongahela National Forest covers much of the highland terrain. The Greenbrier River Trail follows the old railroad grade south along the river. Hikers come in summer for the spruce forests and the solitude and the views from the Allegheny ridgelines. Some of them, walking the lower section of trails that pass near what used to be called Harlan Hollow, report an unusual difficulty with their phone compasses. The screens showing north one moment and northwest the next, the little arrow spinning slightly before settling. They note this as a technical quirk and keep walking. The boundary marker, if it's still there, is under a lot of undergrowth. Nobody has looked for it since Marsh, as far as we know. The cave system beneath the hollow hasn't been fully mapped. The 1935 remains were never identified. The transit in the cave was last documented in 1952. Hale and Burnett's company records were destroyed in a fire in their Charleston offices in 1912. 3 men walked into those hollows in the 1880s. None of them came out. We know something about why. We don't know everything. In a case like this one, the honest conclusion is to say that the evidence points in 3 directions simultaneously, and that any certainty you feel about which direction is right is probably a product of what you brought into the case rather than what the case tells you. That was Marsh's conclusion. It's ours, too. Franklin Cole, age 34. Thomas Rader, age 28. George Sinnate, age 41. Their names are in the county records in Marlinton. They're in the Hale and Burnett employment ledgers in the state archives. They are not in any cemetery that has been identified. What happened to them in the lower hollow of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, in the years between 1885 and 1887 is unknown. The measurements didn't work. Something was taking the angles. We may never know what.